Jen Psaki's hiring by MSNBC was one of the many examples of how utterly broken the
Yeah.
Acela Media industrial complex is. For the first time in United States history, a sitting president seeking reelection had his press secretary go and work for a major media enterprise and anchor a show. And no one said anything about how irregular, how newsworthy, how out of line that was. And we have hundreds, I've seen scores of media writers. And I know this because they've written about me when one of my private Instagram accounts leaked and I said something that was deemed too offensive by the chattering classes. Nevertheless, these people couldn't lift a finger to type a letter about how out of line, how irregular that was, and what it represented. So when we come to our current moment, Jen Psaki, MSNBC, represents a very particular inflection point, as does the Biden presidency and the way in which the press covered it that leads us to where we are today.
Amen, brother. And let me put a sharper point on one thing you said. Of all the examples of liberal media bias denied by the people who run the big organizations, of all the examples, perhaps the most egregious is they hire media writers who are far, far left,
Ding, ding, ding,
as
ding,
if
ding.
they're covering the media fairly. If you're going to have a media writer whose job it is to hold the media account, you cannot hire people who hate Donald Trump. And their coverage isn't subtle. It's not like some of the New York Times coverage, for instance, where within the crevices of the paragraphs you can see they're biased against Trump. They are full on resistance writers, and that's why they write negative things about Mark Caputo and me, and why they did not touch this Jen Psaki story. It's batshit crazy for these organizations who claim to be serious news organizations to have as their media reporters leading members of the resistance, unapologetic and explicit, who to this day have not written about Joe Biden, the lack of coverage of Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity. To this day, they have not written about the biggest media story of all time. And instead, they're writing about Stephen Miller's demeanor in a cable news hit. Donald, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Michael, did you want to say something?
I was just going to chime in with my own experience, but
Feel free.
no,
We have time.
I've been shocked to find out. I mean, like I was smeared by the Biden White House for just being not even. And I was 18 months gone from the White House, and I was only critical of the strategy. I was never critical of Biden himself. I was their son's biggest public advocate, which they also didn't like. But I couldn't believe that CNN blacklisted me because of the White House, the Biden campaign, and the Biden White House basically threatened their White House unit with access. And I was
thank you, thank you for giving me another example. Your example is a great one.
Hmm.
Did those liberal media reporters write about Bobby Kennedy being blacklisted? An incredible story. An incredible story. Bobby Kennedy trying to run for the Democratic nomination, and the media will not put him on. They'll
or
put Dean Phillips. Another incredible example. And
Casey
and
did not ever.
and
Not
and they will put Adam Schiff on, whose public failures of credibility are more pronounced than Dean Phillips, and in terms of implications, I would say you could argue comparable to Bobby Kennedy's. It's insane that they didn't put them on, but it's more insane that people whose job it is to write about the press and hold the press accountable didn't write a word about
Interesting. I just put in the chat if people want to read it. It's called the Digital Panopticon: How Online Communities Reinforce Themselves Through Social Media. It has greatly affected the way in which the press covers things. So rather than babble on and on about it, I just put it in there.
Thank
Again,
you.
the
Thank you,
title,
Thank you,
no
Professor.
problem. The title is the Digital Panopticon: